When Knight Rider premiered in 1982, it didn't simply introduce a television show, it introduced a technological fantasy that felt just close enough to reality to be unsettling. At its heart was a promise that machines could be loyal, intelligent, and even moral. What many viewers never realized is that this idea was born not from science fiction writers, but from a very practical fear inside television studios at the time. Networks were terrified that audiences were losing interest in traditional heroes. Cars, gadgets, and technology were becoming the new stars, and Knight Rider was conceived as a direct response to that shift, with the automobile deliberately designed to be more memorable than the human driving it. The voice of KITT, calm, educated, and faintly superior, was essential to that illusion. William Daniels recorded his lines alone, never interacting with David Hasselhoff during filming. This separation wasn't accidental. The producers believed that if Daniels remained detached, his performance would sound less human and more machine-like. Ironically, this decision gave KITT a sense of authority and emotional restraint that made him feel wiser than most human characters on television at the time, reinforcing the unsettling idea that the car might actually be the most intelligent presence on screen. KITT's iconic red scanner light was not inspired by futuristic design trends, but by a much older source. The effect was adapted from the 1970s series Battlestar Galactica, where the silent scanning eye conveyed constant vigilance and menace. By borrowing this visual language, Knight Rider subtly framed KITT as something potentially dangerous, even when he was acting as a hero. That tension between protector and threat is one reason the car never felt like a simple gadget, but like a controlled force that could turn if mishandled. The Pontiac Trans Am used for KITT was chosen less for its performance and more for its shape. Its long, low nose allowed the scanner to appear almost like a living eye, while the dark, glossy paint hid imperfections under studio lighting. What's rarely mentioned is that the car's real-world performance often failed to match the show's ambitions. Many action scenes were shot at relatively low speeds and later enhanced with editing, sound design, and dramatic camera angles to create the illusion of power that the vehicle itself couldn't reliably deliver. Knight Rider also reflected a deep cultural anxiety of the early 1980s, the fear of crime that felt uncontrollable and faceless. Michael Knight wasn't a traditional lawman tied to rules or jurisdictions. He operated with near-total freedom, guided by a private foundation and a machine that could outthink criminals. This structure mirrored a growing public fascination with private solutions to public problems, a theme that quietly runs beneath the show's glossy surface and helps explain its massive appeal at the time. Even the name Knight Rider was carefully chosen to evoke myth rather than realism. The idea of a lone knight, guided by an almost magical steed, was no accident. KITT functioned as a modern-day warhorse, armored not with steel but with algorithms and circuits. This medieval echo gave the series a timeless quality, allowing it to feel like a legend retold through technology rather than a story trapped in its era. Behind the scenes, the production relied on multiple KITT cars, each modified for a specific purpose. Some were built purely for stunts, others for close-up shots of the dashboard, and a few were barely functional shells. The illusion of a single, perfect machine was maintained through meticulous continuity, reinforcing the fantasy that KITT was indestructible, even though the reality was far more fragile. What made Knight Rider endure wasn't just the spectacle, but the quiet trust between man and machine. In an age before the internet, before smartphones, the show asked a daring question. What if technology didn't just serve us, but understood us? That question, more than the turbo boosts or talking dashboards, is why Knight Rider still resonates today, long after the roads it once ruled have changed beyond recognition. As the series gained momentum, Knight Rider quietly redefined what television audiences expected from action storytelling. One of its most unusual creative decisions was to make Michael Knight deliberately incomplete without KITT. Scripts were often structured so that Michael would make an emotional or impulsive choice, only for the car to correct him with logic and data. This dynamic inverted the traditional hero narrative of the era, subtly suggesting that human intuition alone was no longer sufficient in a world increasingly shaped by technology. The famous dashboard sequences, with KITT's animated displays and scrolling diagnostics, were far more symbolic than functional. Most of those graphics were not real computer outputs at all, but carefully designed animations meant to communicate intelligence visually. At a time when home computers were still rare, these displays shaped the public's imagination of what artificial intelligence looked like, influencing everything from later TV shows to early video game interfaces. The idea that intelligence could be seen, not just heard, was a powerful illusion that Knight Rider helped cement. David Hasselhoff's performance was also shaped by constraints viewers never noticed. He was often required to act opposite a car that wasn't speaking at all during filming. Timing, reactions, and emotional beats had to be guessed rather than felt. This forced a slightly exaggerated delivery that, rather than weakening the show, gave Michael Knight a mythic clarity. His expressions were broader, his pauses more deliberate, making the character readable even when half the conversation existed only in post-production. The foundation for law and government, or flag, was intentionally left vague. Audiences were never given a clear explanation of its funding, oversight, or legal authority. This ambiguity wasn't lazy writing, but a conscious choice. The creators wanted flag to feel omnipotent yet distant, a shadow institution that existed outside normal systems. In doing so, Knight Rider tapped into a popular Cold War-era fascination with secret organizations that operated beyond public scrutiny, feeding both trust and unease. Music played a crucial role in shaping the show's emotional memory. The iconic theme, driven by synthesizers, was designed to sound futuristic without feeling cold. Its pulsing rhythm mirrored a heartbeat, subtly humanizing the machine at the center of the story. This blending of electronic sound with emotional warmth was rare at the time and helped audiences accept KITT not as a threat, but as a companion. One of the show's most overlooked elements is how often KITT refuses commands. Unlike typical fictional machines, he is not blindly obedient. He questions Michael, delays actions, and sometimes outright refuses if he calculates excessive risk. This was a radical portrayal of artificial intelligence for early 1980s television. It suggested that true intelligence includes ethical judgment, not just speed or power, a concept that feels remarkably current today. Knight Rider also reflected the era's fascination with invulnerability. KITT's nearly indestructible shell offered a fantasy of safety in a decade marked by economic uncertainty and geopolitical tension. Yet the writers frequently introduced scenarios where KITT's systems were compromised, hacked, or temporarily disabled. These moments weren't just plot devices. They reminded viewers that dependence on technology carries its own vulnerabilities, a message quietly woven into the show's optimism. Even the open highways themselves were symbolic. Knight Rider rarely lingered in cities. Its world was one of endless roads, deserts, and borderless landscapes. This visual language reinforced the idea of freedom without boundaries, echoing a uniquely American mythos at a time when many felt increasingly constrained by modern life. The car didn't just travel through these spaces, it embodied the promise that escape was still possible. By the mid-1980s, Knight Rider had become more than entertainment. It was a reflection of hope and hesitation, a mirror held up to a society standing at the edge of the digital age. The series didn't predict the future so much as it asked whether humanity was ready to share its identity with machines that could think, decide, and perhaps one day judge. As Knight Rider approached its later seasons, the series began to reveal an unexpected self-awareness. The writers increasingly treated KITT not as a marvel, but as a responsibility. Episodes explored what happened when advanced technology fell into the wrong hands, and these stories carried an unusually sober tone for primetime television. Rather than celebrating innovation blindly, the show questioned who deserved access to power when that power could no longer be physically restrained. One of the most striking creative risks was introducing KITT's dark counterpart. Unlike typical villain machines, Carr wasn't evil by malfunction. He was logical to a fault, operating on a cold interpretation of survival and dominance. This contrast reframed KITT's personality as a deliberate choice rather than a default setting. Intelligence alone was not enough. Values had to be programmed, and even then, they required constant reinforcement. In hindsight, this storyline feels less like science fiction and more like an early meditation on the ethics of artificial intelligence alignment. The relationship between Michael Knight and KITT also evolved in subtle but meaningful ways. Early episodes framed KITT as a mentor, often correcting Michael's emotional impulses. Later stories reversed that dynamic, with Michael defending human intuition against KITT's calculations. This shift suggested a growing tension between logic and experience, reflecting a cultural moment when society was beginning to question whether efficiency should always outweigh empathy. Another rarely discussed aspect is how Knight Rider treated identity. Michael Knight himself is a constructed persona, a man literally rebuilt with a new face and name. The show quietly parallels his transformation with KITT's artificial consciousness. Both are creations, shaped by design rather than birth. This symmetry invites an unsettling question. If both man and machine are engineered, where does authenticity truly reside? The series never answers directly, but it never lets the question disappear. The show's visual restraint also deserves attention. Despite its futuristic premise, Knight Rider avoided overly extravagant production design. Interiors were sparse, locations were grounded, and effects were used selectively. This restraint made the advanced technology feel plausible rather than fantastical. By keeping one foot firmly in the real world, the series allowed audiences to imagine KITT not as a distant fantasy, but as an imminent possibility. As popularity grew, merchandising exploded, but the show itself resisted becoming a parody of its own success. Unlike many contemporaries, Knight Rider rarely leaned into self-mockery. It took its premise seriously, even when plots became more adventurous. This sincerity is one reason the series aged more gracefully than many action shows of its era. It believed in its world, and that belief translated to the audience. When the series eventually ended, it did so quietly, without grand finales or dramatic conclusions. Michael Knight simply continued driving into the unknown, a deliberate choice that reinforced the show's core philosophy. Knight Rider was never about closure. It was about motion, vigilance, and the idea that the journey mattered more than the destination. The open road remained, as did the questions the series had raised. Today, Knight Rider occupies a unique place in cultural memory. It is often remembered for its talking car and electronic theme, yet its deeper legacy lies in how it framed the relationship between humans and machines. Long before digital assistants and autonomous vehicles became real discussions, the series treated technology as a partner that demanded trust, skepticism, and moral clarity. In the end, Knight Rider endures because it understood something timeless. Progress is not defined by speed or power, but by restraint. A machine that can do everything is meaningless without a reason to stop. And a hero, no matter how advanced his tools, remains human precisely because he doubts, questions, and chooses responsibility over domination. That quiet wisdom, embedded beneath neon lights and roaring engines, is what still echoes every time KITT's scanner sweeps across the screen, searching not just the road ahead, but the values guiding the journey.